The metal chair creaked under Commander Zekel's weight as he settled into his usual spot in the corner of the officers' lounge. His 6 eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the young faces that had gathered around him. They were all so eager, so full of questions about the war that had ended 15 cycles ago. The war that still haunted his dreams. The lounge was dimly lit, with soft blue lights casting long shadows across the metal walls of the research vessel Harmony's edge. Outside the reinforced windows, stars drifted past like distant memories. But Zekel's attention was not on the stars. It was on the amber liquid in his drinking vessel and on the memories that refused to leave him alone. "Commander," said a young Altarian recruit, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true what they say about the humans, that they fought like demons?" Zekel's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. His species did not smile the way humans did, but the expression held the same bitter knowledge. "Demons," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe them. But demons you could understand. Demons follow rules. Humans do not." The recruits leaned forward, their various eyes and sensory organs focused on the old warrior. There were 12 of them tonight, representing 6 different species from across the coalition. All young, all untested, all believing they understood war because they had read about it in training manuals. "You want to know about humans," Zekel said, his voice carrying the weight of too many battles. "Everyone thinks they know. The propaganda feeds show them as savages. The tactical reports call them unpredictable. The historians write about their primitive weapons and lack of proper shields, but none of that tells you what they really are." He took a long drink from his vessel, the amber liquid burning down his throat. "I will tell you what they are. They are the only species in this galaxy that fights harder when they are losing than when they are winning." A young Centauri officer shifted uncomfortably. "But that makes no sense, Commander. Logic dictates that losses should reduce morale and fighting effectiveness." "Logic," Zekel repeated, and this time his smile was definitely bitter. "Yes, we thought logic would win the war. We had superior numbers, better weapons, stronger shields. We had conquered 17 species before we encountered the humans. Logic said they would surrender after the first major defeat." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I first met them on Kepler 442b, a mining colony barely worth the effort to capture. We needed the rare earth elements for our ship construction, and intelligence said the colony was lightly defended. My battalion of 300 soldiers, against perhaps 50 humans. It should have been over in hours." The recruits were completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the ship's ventilation system seemed to have quieted, as if the vessel itself was listening. "The human commander was Lieutenant Jake Morrison," Zekel continued. 28 years old, according to the files we captured later. He had been a mining engineer before the war, not even a real soldier. His squad consisted of 12 men and women, most of them former miners and technicians. They had no military training, no proper equipment, no chance of survival. He drained his vessel and set it down with a metallic clink. We landed at dawn, expecting to find a colony preparing to surrender. Instead, we found empty buildings and silent streets. The humans had evacuated the civilians during the night, leaving only Morrison and his volunteers to hold the main processing facility. 12 against 300, whispered a vegan recruit. They must have been terrified. "That is what we thought," Zekel said. "We thought fear would make them surrender quickly. We were wrong. Fear made them dangerous." The old commander stood up, his joints protesting after too many years of war. He walked to the window, looking out at the stars. The processing facility was built into a mountain with only 3 entrances. Morrison's people had blocked 2 of them with mining equipment, leaving only the main entrance open. We thought they were trapped. He turned back to face the recruits. "We sent in the first assault wave at noon. 50 soldiers, the best we had, they never came back out? What happened to them?" asked the Altarian recruit. "Morrison had turned the entire facility into a trap," Zekel explained. The humans knew every tunnel, every room, every piece of equipment. They had rigged the mining lasers to fire down the corridors. They had filled the air recycling system with toxic gases from the processing chemicals. They had even programmed the maintenance robots to attack anyone in coalition uniforms. He began pacing slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet lounge. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that they fought like it was personal. Every human we killed seemed to make the others fight harder, not weaker. When we finally breached the main control room, we found Morrison's communications. Officer Sergeant Danny Cole still at his post. He had been shot 3 times, but he was still calling in artillery strikes on our positions outside. Artillery? Asked a young Denebian. But the report said the humans had no heavy weapons on that colony. They did not, Zechthel confirmed. Cole was directing the mining charges. The humans had wired the entire mountain with explosives meant for extraction. Every time we tried to bring in reinforcements, they would collapse a tunnel or bring down a section of the mountain. They turned their own workplace into a weapon. The recruits exchanged glances. This was not the kind of warfare they had learned about in their training. This was something else entirely. We lost 47 soldiers taking that control room, Zechthel continued. And when we finally got inside, we found Cole still alive? Still fighting. He had jury-rigged a mining laser to his wheelchair after his legs were crushed. Even dying, he was trying to kill us. What did you do? Asked the Centauri officer. We showed him the mercy his species never showed us, Zechthel said quietly. We ended his suffering quickly. But as he died, he smiled. He actually smiled. Later, we found out why. He had been buying time for the other humans to set their final trap. The commander walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. Morrison and his remaining 8 soldiers had barricaded themselves in the main processing chamber. We had them. Surrounded, no way out, no hope of rescue. Any sane species would have surrendered. Instead, Morrison sent us a message. What did he say? Whispered the vegan recruit. He said, "Come and take it." Zechtel's voice was barely audible. 3 words, that was all. Come and take it. The lounge was completely silent now. Even the ship's engines seemed to have quieted to listen to the old warrior's tale. We blasted open the chamber doors, Zechtel said. What we found inside changed everything I thought I knew about war. The humans had built a fortress out of mining equipment and scrap metal. They had no shields, no proper weapons, nothing but their determination and their refusal to give up. He looked up at the recruits, his 6 eyes filled with something that might have been fear or respect. Morrison was the last one standing. He had been shot 11 times, but he was still fighting. He had picked up a mining pick, a simple tool, and he was using it like a weapon. When we finally brought him down, he was still trying to swing it at us. How long did the battle last? Asked the Altarian. 3 days, Zechtel said. 3 days to capture 1 building defended by 12 humans. We started with 300 soldiers. We finished with 137. Morrison and his people had killed or wounded over half my battalion. The recruits sat in stunned silence. This was not the easy victory their training had promised them. This was something else, something that made their carefully learned tactics seem useless. That was my first lesson about humans, Zechtel concluded. They do not fight to win. They fight so that their enemies cannot win either, and sometimes that is the same thing. He stood up again, preparing to leave. Tomorrow night I will tell you about Captain Lisa Harper and the impossible rescue on Vega Prime, but tonight think about what you have learned. Think about Morrison and his 12 volunteers and ask yourself this question: what would you die for? As the old commander walked toward the door, one of the recruits called out, "Commander, did we ever find out why Morrison fought so hard?" What was worth dying for? Zechtel paused at the doorway, his hand on the metal frame. We found a picture in his pocket, he said quietly. A human female and 2 small children. His family, we assumed. They had been evacuated with the other civilians. He died so they could live free. He left the lounge, leaving the young recruits to contemplate the meaning of his words. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the stories of war and sacrifice that played out among the small creatures who dared to travel between them. In the silence that followed, each recruit wondered if they would have the courage to fight like Morrison when their time came, and deep in their hearts most of them feared they would not. The next evening, the young recruits gathered in the officers' lounge again. Word had spread through the ship about Commander HFY's stories, and tonight there were 18 soldiers present instead of 12. They came from different shifts, different departments, all drawn by the need to understand what they might face if they ever encountered humans in battle. HFY sat in his usual corner, but tonight his amber drink remained untouched. His 6 eyes were focused on something far beyond the metal walls of the ship, something that existed only in his memories. The recruits waited in respectful silence, sensing that tonight's story would be different from the last. "You think Morrison's last stand was impressive," the old commander finally said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "But that was just one battle, one small group of humans fighting for their home. What I will tell you tonight is about something much more dangerous. I will tell you about what humans do when they are trying to save each other." He picked up his drink but did not taste it. This happened 6 months after Kepler 442b. By then, the war had spread to 17 star systems. We had learned not to underestimate human defensive positions, but we still thought we understood their limitations. We thought we knew how they would respond to certain situations. A young Zephyrian recruit raised one of her 4 arms. "What kind of situations, Commander?" "Hostage situations," HFY replied. "We had captured a human research station on Vega Prime, an ice world at the edge of their space. The station had been studying the planet's unique crystal formations, work that was valuable to both sides. More importantly, it had 200 human researchers and support staff." He finally took a sip of his drink, grimacing as the liquid burned down his throat. The station was built into a mountain, much like the mining facility on Kepler 442b, but this time we were the ones inside the fortress. We had proper defensive positions, energy shields, and enough supplies to last for months. The humans had no way to reach us without killing their own people. "Surely they would have to negotiate," said a Centauri officer. "Logic dictates that they would trade something valuable for the lives of 200 civilians." HFY's expression might have been a smile, but it held no warmth. "Logic, yes, we thought logic would force them to see reason." We contacted the human fleet and demanded they withdraw from the Vega system. In exchange, we would release half the hostages. It seemed like a fair trade. "What did they say?" asked the Altarian recruit who had been present the night before. "They said they needed time to consider our offer," HFY replied. "We gave them 48 hours. During that time, we intercepted their communications and learned that Captain Lisa Harper was in command of the rescue operation. She had 20 Special Forces soldiers and 2 small ships. Against our fortress and our garrison of 800 troops." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. We laughed when we saw how small her force was. 20 soldiers against 800, with no heavy weapons and no way to breach our defenses. Even if they somehow got inside, they would have to fight through our entire garrison without harming the hostages. It was impossible. "But they tried anyway," said a young Denebian, his voice filled with certainty. "They did more than try," HFY confirmed. "They did something that changed everything we thought we knew about human tactics. Instead of attacking the fortress, they surrendered to us." The recruits exchanged confused glances. This was not what they had expected to hear. "Harper contacted us 12 hours before the deadline," HFY continued. "She said her government had decided the hostages were too valuable to risk in a military operation. She offered to surrender herself and her entire team in exchange for the release of 50 hostages. She claimed it was a gesture of good faith before formal negotiations began." He turned back to face the recruits. "We thought it was a trick, of course. But we scanned their ships thoroughly before they docked. No weapons, no explosives, no hidden equipment. Harper and her 20 soldiers came aboard with nothing but the clothes on their backs and basic medical supplies. You accepted their surrender? Asked the Zephyrian recruit. We did, Zechthel admitted. It seemed like a victory without a fight. We had captured a human special forces commander and her entire team. We put them in holding cells next to the research station's personnel and increased our security. We thought we had won. The old commander returned to his chair and sat down heavily. That was our first mistake. We thought we were dealing with a surrender when we were actually dealing with an infiltration. Harper had not given up. She had simply changed the battlefield. What do you mean? Asked the Centauri officer. The medical supplies they brought with them were not medical supplies, Zechthel explained. They were weapon components, cleverly disguised and hidden in ways our scanners could not detect. Harper's team had memorized the complete schematics of the research station during their approach. They knew exactly where to place each component to maximize their effectiveness. He paused, his eyes growing distant. But that was not the most dangerous part of their plan. The most dangerous part was what we discovered about the hostages themselves. What about them? Whispered the vegan recruit. They were not helpless researchers, Zechthel said quietly. Oh, they were scientists, that much was true. But they were also former military personnel. Every single one of them had served in the human armed forces before becoming civilians. Harper had not just surrendered her team. She had joined them with 200 trained soldiers who had been waiting for the right moment to act. The silence in the lounge was complete now. Even the ship's ventilation system seemed to have stopped. The rescue began at exactly midnight, ship time, Zechthel continued. Harper's team had spent 3 days in captivity, building their weapons and coordinating with the hostages. When they moved, it was with the precision of a military operation that had been planned for years instead of hours. How did they communicate without you knowing? Asked the Altarian recruit. Medical examinations, Zechthel replied. Every day we allowed the hostages to check on each other's health. They claimed it was for morale purposes to make sure everyone was staying strong. We thought it was harmless. We were wrong. They were passing information, coordinating their actions, preparing for the moment when Harper would give the signal. He stood up again and began pacing, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Sergeant Danny Cole was the first to move. He had been captured along with Harper's team, but during the medical examinations he had been studying our power systems. When the time came, he disabled the main generator with a device built from medical scanner components. In the dark? Asked the Denebian recruit. Humans see better in darkness than we do, Zechthel explained. It was an advantage we had not considered. While we were stumbling around trying to restore power, Harper's people were moving through the station like they owned it. They had divided into teams, each with a specific objective. What were their objectives? Asked the Zephyrian recruit. Lieutenant Amy Watson took control of the communications center, Zechthel said. She held off our reinforcements for 2 hours, fighting alone in a narrow corridor. She had been shot 4 times, but she kept fighting until her team completed their mission. Her sacrifice saved dozens of lives. He paused at the window again, his reflection staring back at him from the reinforced glass. But it was Harper herself who showed us what human leadership really meant. She did not give orders from a safe position. She led from the front, taking the most dangerous assignments for herself. What did she do? Asked the Centauri officer. She went after our command center, Zechthel replied. The most heavily defended position in the entire station. She had to fight through 3 security checkpoints and a squad of our best troops. By the time she reached the command center, she was wounded and exhausted, but she kept going. Did she make it? Whispered the vegan recruit. She made it, Zechthel confirmed. And when she took control of our systems, she did something that still gives me nightmares. She turned our own defenses against us. Our security turrets, our blast doors, our communication systems, everything we had built to keep enemies out. She used to trap us inside. He walked back to his chair but did not sit down. The entire operation took 47 minutes. 47 minutes to turn our impregnable fortress into a prison. When it was over, Harper controlled the station. And we were the ones who needed to be rescued. How many casualties did you take? Asked the Altarian recruit. 67 dead, over 200 wounded, Zechthel said quietly. Harper's team lost 3 soldiers. The hostages lost none. We had been outfought, outhot, and outmaneuvered by people we thought were helpless prisoners. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had heard. This was not the kind of warfare they had trained for. This was something beyond their understanding. That was my second lesson about humans, Zechthel concluded. They do not think like we do. Where we see an impossible situation, they see an opportunity. Where we see defeat, they see a different kind of victory, and they never ever give up on their own people. He finally sat down and picked up his drink. Tomorrow night I will tell you about Colonel Pete Martinez and the Scorched. Earth Protocol? The officers' lounge was packed tonight. Word about Commander Zechthel stories had spread throughout the entire ship, and now soldiers from every department crowded into the space. Some sat on the floor, others leaned against the walls. All of them waited in silence for the old warrior to begin his third tale. Zechthel noticed the crowd but said nothing about it. He sat in his corner chair, his 6 eyes unfocused, his scarred hands wrapped around his drinking vessel. Tonight, the amber liquid remained completely untouched. The recruits had learned to read his moods, and tonight felt different. Tonight felt heavier. By the 3rd year of the war, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, we thought we had learned everything there was to know about human warfare. We had studied their tactics, adapted our strategies, improved our defenses. We had convinced ourselves that the early defeats were just learning experiences. He looked up at the crowd of young faces surrounding him. We were wrong. We had learned nothing. Because the most important lesson about humans is not how they fight when they think they can win. It is how they fight when they know they are going to lose. A young Altarian recruit who had been present for both previous stories raised his hand. What do you mean, Commander? I mean that humans become most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose, Zechthel replied. When victory becomes impossible, they change the rules of the game. They make sure that nobody wins. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting after too many years of carrying the weight of memories. This happened on New Terra, the most important agricultural world in human space. The planet fed 17 human colonies and 3 orbital stations. Without it, the human resistance would collapse within months. So you attacked it, said a Centauri officer. We did more than attack it, Zechthel corrected. We assembled the largest invasion force in coalition history. 5,000 ships, 2 million soldiers, enough firepower to crack a moon. We needed New Terra intact, you understand. A dead planet would not feed anyone. He walked to the window and stared out at the stars. Colonel Pete Martinez commanded the planetary defense. He had maybe 50,000 soldiers and a handful of outdated ships. Against our 2 million troops, he had no chance of victory. Any rational commander would have surrendered to save civilian lives. But he did not surrender, said a young Denebian, his voice filled with certainty. No, Zechthel. Confirmed. He did something much worse. He activated what the humans called the Scorched Earth Protocol. The silence in the lounge was absolute. Even the ship's engines seemed to have quieted to listen. We landed on New Terra expecting to find a planet preparing for occupation, Zechthel continued. Instead, we found a world committing suicide. Martinez had spent the previous 6 months preparing for this moment. Every agricultural facility, every processing plant, every piece of infrastructure that made the planet valuable had been rigged with explosives. He turned back to face the crowd. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that Martinez did not just destroy military targets. He destroyed everything. The soil treatment plants, the water purification systems, the atmospheric processors. He turned the entire planet into a weapon pointed at itself. Why? Asked a Zephyrian recruit. What was the point of destroying their own world? Because a dead planet is worthless to an invader, Zechthel explained. Martinez understood something that we did not. He understood that some things are more Important than survival. Some things are worth dying for. He began pacing slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The destruction began the moment our first dropships touched down. Lieutenant Kate Phillips led a demolition team that had been working for months to prepare the agricultural centers. She and her people had hidden explosives in every major facility on the planet. "How many facilities?" asked the Altarian recruit. "Over 3,000, Zechthel replied. Phillips and her team of 30 engineers had spent half a year crawling through maintenance tunnels and storage areas, placing charges in exactly the right locations to cause maximum damage. They knew every pipe, every circuit, every structural weakness. He paused at the window again, his reflection staring back at him from the reinforced glass. When the explosions began, they did not stop. Phillips had timed everything perfectly. One facility would explode, causing a chain reaction that would destroy two more. The chemical processing plants released toxins into the soil. The water treatment centers pumped contaminated waste into the rivers. "She was destroying her own planet," whispered a vegan recruit. "She was saving it," Zechthel corrected. "Because a poisoned planet could not feed our armies. A contaminated world could not support our occupation." Phillips understood that sometimes the only way to win is to make sure your enemy cannot win either. He walked back toward his chair but did not sit down. But Phillips was not the only one. Major Ben Rodriguez commanded the main spaceport, the largest on the planet. We needed that spaceport to land our heavy equipment and supply ships. Rodriguez knew this. What did he do? Asked the Centauri officer. He held the spaceport alone for 6 hours, Zechthel said quietly. His entire regiment had been evacuated with the civilians, but Rodriguez stayed behind to buy time for the demolition teams. He had rigged the entire facility with explosives, but he waited until the last possible moment to detonate them. Why did he wait? Asked the Denebian recruit. Because civilian transports were still launching, Zechthel explained. Rodriguez was covering their escape. Every minute he delayed the destruction was another minute for families to get away. He fought our entire advance force by himself, using automated defenses and remote weapons. He finally sat down, his scarred face showing the weight of his memories. We found Rodriguez's body in the control tower after the spaceport exploded. He had been shot 17 times, but he was still at his post, still coordinating the civilian evacuation, still fighting. How long did the battle for New Terra last? Asked the Zephyrian recruit. 3 weeks, Zechthel replied. 3 weeks to capture a planet that was destroying itself faster than we could conquer it. Every day more facilities exploded. Every day more infrastructure was sabotaged. By the time we had eliminated all organized resistance, New Terra was uninhabitable. He picked up his drink but did not taste it. The final act came from Martinez himself. When we surrounded his last stronghold, he sent us a message. He said that New Terra would never feed coalition armies. He said that a free planet was better than a living one. What did he mean? Asked the Altarian recruit. He meant that the humans had won by losing, Zechthel explained. We had captured New Terra, but we had gained nothing. The planet was poisoned, the soil was contaminated, the infrastructure was destroyed. It would take decades to make it habitable again, decades we did not have. The old commander finally took a sip of his drink, grimacing as the liquid burned down his throat, but Martinez was not finished. His final message told us that every human world had been prepared the same way. Every planet, every station, every facility that we might want to capture had been rigged for destruction. All of them? Whispered the vegan recruit. All of them, Zechthel confirmed. The humans had turned their entire civilization into a weapon. They had decided that if they could not live free, they would make sure we could not benefit from their deaths. He stood up again and walked to the center of the room, looking at each of the recruits in turn. That was when we realized we were not fighting a war of conquest, we were fighting a war of extinction. The humans had decided that they would rather die as a free species than live as slaves. What happened to Martinez? Asked the Centauri. Officer, he died in the final assault on his command bunker, Zechthel said quietly. But before he died, he activated the last phase of the Scorched Earth Protocol. He triggered seismic charges that had been placed in the planet's crust. New Terra shook itself apart. The recruits sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had heard. This was beyond warfare as they understood it. This was something else entirely. We learned something important that day, Zechthel continued. We learned that humans do not just fight with weapons. They fight with their willingness to sacrifice everything for their principles. They fight with their refusal to compromise their values. He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. That was my third lesson about humans. They do not fear death, they fear slavery. They fear being forced to live without freedom. And they will destroy everything they have built rather than let an enemy take it from them. Did the Coalition continue the war after New Terra? Asked the Zephyrian recruit. We tried, Zechthel admitted. But every planet we approached was ready to destroy itself. Every facility we wanted to capture was rigged with explosives. Every victory we achieved was worthless because the humans made sure we gained nothing from it. He picked up his drink and drained it in one swallow. Tomorrow night I will tell you about the final battle at Earth itself. But tonight, think about Colonel Martinez and his choice. Think about what it means to value freedom more than life itself. As the recruits filed out of the lounge, each one carried with them a new understanding of what true determination looked like. They had learned that some species would rather burn everything to the ground than live on their knees. The officers' lounge could not hold everyone who wanted to hear Commander Zechthel story tonight. Soldiers crowded into the corridors outside, straining to listen through the open doorway. Some had brought recording devices, hoping to preserve the old warrior's words for others who could not be present. The ship's captain had even given permission for the evening shift to attend. Understanding that these stories were more valuable than any training manual, Zechthel sat in his corner, but tonight he seemed smaller somehow. His 6 eyes were dim, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he held his drinking vessel. The amber liquid inside had been untouched for so long that condensation beaded on the outside of the container. The recruits waited in absolute silence, sensing that tonight's tale would be the most difficult for their commander to tell. 4 years, he said finally, his voice so quiet that those in the back had to lean forward to hear. 4 years of war, and we had achieved nothing. Every planet we captured was worthless. Every victory cost us more than we gained. The Coalition High Command was growing desperate. He looked up at the sea of faces surrounding him, young soldiers from a dozen different species, all hanging on his every word. So they decided to end it. They assembled every ship, every soldier, every weapon we had left. The largest armada in galactic history. 5,000 warships, carrying 3 million troops. Our target was Earth itself. A young Altarian recruit who had been present for all 3 previous stories spoke up. The human homeworld. Yes, Zechthel confirmed, the heart of their resistance. The Coalition leadership believed that if we could capture Earth, the remaining human colonies would surrender. They believed that no species would sacrifice their birth world. He stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Admiral Susan Clark commanded the defense of Earth. She had perhaps 300 ships left in the entire human fleet. Against our 5,000 vessels, she had no chance of victory. The outcome was decided before the battle even began. But she fought anyway, said a Centauri officer, and it was not a question. She fought anyway, Zechthel agreed. But this was different from the other battles I have told you about. This was not about tactics or strategy or clever tricks. This was about something much simpler. This was about a species making their final stand. He walked to the window and stared out at the stars, his reflection ghost-like in the reinforced glass. The battle began at dawn, Earth time. Our fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, ready to overwhelm the human defenses with sheer numbers. Clark's ships were waiting for us. What was their formation? Asked the young Denebian. They had no formation, Zechthel replied. They were scattered across the system like seeds in the wind. It made no tactical sense. They should have concentrated their forces, tried to punch through our lines at a single point. Instead, they seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He turned back to face the crowd. That was when we realized that Clark was not trying to win the battle. She was trying to make us pay the highest possible price for our victory. Every human ship was a weapon pointed at our fleet. Every human pilot was ready to die if it meant taking coalition vessels with them. Suicide attacks? Whispered a vegan recruit. Worse than suicide attacks, Zekthal said quietly. Suicide attacks are desperate. What the humans did was calculated. They had studied our ships, learned our weaknesses, planned their deaths down to the smallest detail. They turned dying into an art form. He began pacing slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Captain Ryan Torres commanded a ship called the Defiant. It was an old vessel barely held together with spare parts and determination. Torres brought his ship straight at our flagship, ignoring every weapon we fired at him. Did he make it? Asked the Altarian recruit. He made it, Zekthal confirmed. The Defiant was burning, her hull cracked, her engines failing. But Torres kept her on course. When he rammed into our flagship, the explosion crippled our command structure and killed Admiral Kareth, our fleet commander. He paused by a support beam, his hand resting on the cold metal. But Torres was not alone. Commander Helen Gray led an entire squadron of fighters in what they called a death run. 12 small ships against our main battlecruiser, the Destroyer of Worlds. 12 ships against a battlecruiser? Asked the Zephyrian recruit. 12 ships carrying fusion bombs instead of normal weapons, Zekthal explained. Gray's pilots had removed all defensive systems, all life support equipment, everything. That was not essential. They had turned their fighters into guided missiles. He walked back toward his chair but did not sit down. Gray led them through our defensive fire like she was dancing. Her squadron moved in patterns that should have been impossible, weaving between our weapons as if they knew exactly where each shot would go. When they reached the Destroyer of Worlds, all 12 ships detonated at once. What happened to the battlecruiser? Asked the Centauri officer. It broke in half, Zekthal said simply. The Destroyer of Worlds, pride of the Coalition fleet, split down the middle and died. Gray and her pilots had destroyed the most powerful warship in the galaxy with nothing but small fighters and the willingness to die. The silence in the lounge was complete now. Even the soldiers crowding the corridors had gone quiet, straining to hear every word. But it was Colonel Frank Adams who showed us the true nature of human warfare, Zekthal continued. Adams commanded the orbital defense. Platforms around Earth, massive weapons designed to protect the planet from invasion. He finally sat down, his scarred face showing the weight of terrible memories. When our fleet broke through the outer defenses, Adams faced an impossible choice. Our ships were too close to Earth. If he fired the orbital platforms at us, he would hit his own planet. What did he do? Asked the Denebian recruit. He fired anyway, Zekthal said quietly. Adams turned the defense platforms on Earth itself. He triggered artificial earthquakes, created tidal waves, shattered continents. He destroyed his own world rather than let us have it. The recruits sat in stunned horror. This was beyond anything they had imagined, beyond any nightmare they could have conceived. Millions of humans died in minutes, Zekthal continued. Entire cities disappeared beneath the waves. Mountain ranges collapsed. The atmosphere caught fire. Adams murdered his own planet to deny it to us. Why? Whispered the vegan recruit. Because a dead world cannot be enslaved, Zekthal explained. Because Adams understood that some things are more important than life. He understood that freedom has a price, and he was willing to pay it. He picked up his drink, but his hands were shaking too badly to lift it to his lips. We had won the battle, but we had gained nothing. Earth was uninhabitable, a burned cinder, floating in space. The human fleet was destroyed, but they had taken half our armada with them. And in the end, we realized that we had achieved nothing at all. What happened after Earth? Asked the Altarian recruit. The war ended, Zekthal sighed. Not because the humans surrendered, but because we could not continue. Every victory cost us more than we could afford. Every planet we captured was worthless. The coalition leadership finally understood that conquering humanity was impossible. He stood up again and walked to the center of the room. You see, we thought we were fighting a war of conquest. But the humans were fighting something much more dangerous. They were fighting a war of extinction. They had decided that if they could not live free, no one would benefit from their deaths. "Did any humans survive?" asked the Zephyrian recruit. "Some," Zekthul confirmed. "The outer colonies, the research stations, the mining facilities. Maybe 10 million humans scattered across 50 worlds. But they were no longer the same species we had started fighting." He looked at each of the recruits in turn. The survivors had learned something from watching Earth die. They had learned that freedom is not something you ask for. It is something you take. And they had learned that some enemies can never be defeated, only avoided. "What do you mean?" asked the Centauri officer. "I mean that the surviving humans became something new," Zekthul explained. "They became a species that would rather die than submit. A species that would destroy everything they had built rather than let an enemy take it. They became the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy." He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. "That was my fourth lesson about humans. They do not fear death. They do not fear pain. They do not fear losing everything they have. The only thing they fear is being forced to live without freedom." "Did the coalition ever encounter humans again?" asked the Denebian recruit. "Yes," Zekthul said quietly. "But that is a story for tomorrow night. Tonight, think about Admiral Clark and her hopeless battle. Think about Captain Torres and his final charge. Think about Colonel Adams and his terrible choice. He finally managed to lift his drink to his lips, draining the amber liquid in one desperate swallow. Think about what it means to value something more than life itself. And ask yourself if you would have the courage to make the same choice they did." As the recruits filed out of the lounge, each one carried with them a new understanding of what true sacrifice looked like. They had learned that some species would rather burn the universe than live as slaves. The old commander sat alone in his corner. The officers' lounge was silent as Commander Zekthul entered for the fifth and final time. Word had spread throughout the ship that tonight would be the last story, and every available space was filled with soldiers from dozens of different species. They sat in perfect stillness, knowing that they were about to hear the end of a tale that had changed how they viewed warfare forever. Zekthul looked older tonight, his 6 eyes dimmed by memories too heavy to carry. His scarred hands shook as he settled into his corner chair, and for the first time in 5 nights, he did not bring a drinking vessel with him. The amber liquid that had been his companion through 4 previous tailies was nowhere to be seen. "You think the war ended when Earth burned," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "You think that when a homeworld dies, a species gives up and fades away? You are wrong. The death of Earth was not the end of human resistance. It was the beginning of something much more dangerous." He looked around at the sea of young faces, all focused on him with complete attention. The survivors did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They did not seek peace. Instead, they became something that had never existed before in galactic history. They became a species with nothing left to lose. A young Altarian recruit who had been present for all 4 previous stories raised his hand. "What did they do?" "They disappeared," Zekthul replied. 10 million humans scattered across 50 worlds, and within 6 months, we could not find a single one of them. They had learned to hide, to move, to strike without warning. They had become ghosts." He stood up. Slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "The coalition declared victory and began the process of occupation. We established garrison forces on the former human worlds, built administrative centers, set up supply lines. We thought we were governing conquered territory." "But you were not," said a Centauri officer. "We were walking through a graveyard," Zekthul corrected. "And the dead were watching us." General Mary Ellis and Admiral Joe Hunter had taken the surviving humans and turned them into something new. something that fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple right to exist. He walked to the window and stared out at the stars. The attacks began 3 months after Earth's destruction. Small things at first. Supply convoys that never reached their destinations. Communication relays that mysteriously failed. Garrison commanders who disappeared in the middle of the night. "Guerrilla warfare," said a young Denebian. "More than guerrilla warfare," Zechthel explained. "Guerrillas fight to weaken an enemy. The humans fought to make occupation impossible. Every coalition facility became a target. Every coalition soldier became a victim. Every day we stayed in their space cost us more than we could afford." He turned back to face the crowd. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Wright commanded a resistance cell that operated behind our lines for 3 years, 30 humans against an entire coalition division. We never caught them, never found their base, never predicted their next attack. "How did they avoid detection?" asked a Zephyrian recruit. "They became part of the landscape," Zechthel replied. Wright's people lived in caves, in abandoned buildings, in the spaces between worlds that no one else wanted. They ate what they could find, wore what they could steal, used weapons they built from scrap metal and determination. He began pacing slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet room. But they were not just hiding, they were learning. Every attack taught them something new about our weaknesses. Every raid gave them better equipment and more information. Wright was turning his cell into a weapon specifically designed to kill coalition forces. "What kind of attacks did they make?" asked the Altarian recruit. "Surgical strikes," Zechthel explained. Wright would study a target for weeks, learning patrol patterns, shift changes, supply schedules. Then his people would appear like demons, strike with perfect precision, and vanish before we could respond. He paused by a support beam, his hand resting on the cold metal. "I remember one attack on our ammunition depot on Vega 7, writes. Team infiltrated the facility during a shift change, disabled the guards without killing them, and rigged the entire depot to explode. They were gone before anyone knew they had been there." "Why did they not kill the guards?" asked a vegan recruit. "Because Wright understood something that we did not," Zechthel said. "Dead guards would have been replaced immediately. Traumatized. Guards spread fear and uncertainty throughout our ranks. Wright was fighting a war of psychology as much as a war of weapons." He walked back toward his chair but did not sit down. "The most dangerous attack came 2 years after Earth's destruction. Wright had been watching our main command center on Alpha Centauri, learning our routines, mapping our defenses. He discovered that once a month, all senior officers met for a strategic planning session." "He attacked the command center?" asked the Centauri officer. "He attacked the meeting," Zechthel corrected. Wright and 5 volunteers infiltrated the building during the session. They were not trying to capture territory or steal supplies. They were trying to decapitate our entire command structure. The silence in the lounge was absolute. Even the ship's engines seemed to have quieted to listen. "How did they get inside?" whispered the Denebian recruit. "They walked through the front door," Zechthel said simply. Wright's team had stolen coalition uniforms and identification. They had studied our protocols so carefully that they knew exactly how to act, what to say, where to go. The guards thought they were inspectors from high command. He finally sat down, his scarred face showing the weight of terrible memories. The attack lasted 7 minutes. Wright's team moved through the command center like they had built it themselves. They knew exactly where each officer would be, exactly how the security systems worked, exactly when the next patrol would arrive. "Did they succeed?" asked the Zephyrian recruit. "They killed or wounded every senior officer in the Alpha Centauri sector," Zechthel replied, "including Admiral Varek, who had been my commanding officer for 10 years. Wright and his people crippled our entire operation with 6 soldiers and a handful of improvised weapons." He looked around at the recruits, his 6 eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and respect. But that was not the most important part of Wright's attack. The most important part was what he did before he died. "What did he do?" asked the Altarian recruit. "He sent a message to every human resistance cell in the galaxy," Zechthel explained. Wright had been recording everything during the attack. Video of coalition officers begging for their lives. Audio of our strategic plans. Proof that the mighty coalition could be beaten by a handful of determined humans. He stood up again and walked to the center of the room. That message changed everything. Within weeks, resistance cells were operating on every former human world. Our garrison forces were under constant attack. Our supply lines were cut. Our commanders were afraid to leave their bunkers. "How long did this continue?" asked the Centauri officer. 3 years, Zechthel said quietly. 3 years of bleeding resources, losing soldiers, achieving nothing. The Coalition High Command finally realized that holding human space was impossible. We could defeat them in battle, but we could not make them stop fighting. "So you withdrew," said the vegan recruit. "We retreated," Zechthel corrected. "There is a difference. Withdrawal suggests a planned strategic movement. Retreat means running away from an enemy you cannot defeat. That is what we did. We ran." He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. The humans had taught us the most important lesson in warfare. Victory is not about winning battles. Victory is about making your enemy give up. And humans never give up. "What happened to the surviving humans?" asked the Denebian recruit. "They rebuilt," Zechthel replied. "Not their old civilization, but something new, something harder. They spread across the galaxy like seeds carried by the wind, establishing new colonies, new communities, new ways of life." He looked at each of the recruits in turn, but they never forgot the lessons of the war. Every human child learns about Morrison's last stand, Harper's impossible rescue, Martinez's scorched earth, Adam's final choice. They learn that freedom has a price and some things are worth dying for. "Are they still dangerous?" asked the Zephyrian recruit. "More dangerous than ever," Zechthel confirmed. "Because now they know something that no other species in the galaxy knows. They know that any enemy can be defeated if you are willing to pay the right price. They know that there is no force in the universe stronger than the refusal to surrender." He stood up one final time and walked to the window. The coalition fell apart 5 years after the war ended. Not because of external threats, but because we had lost the will to fight. We had learned that some victories are not worth winning. "And the humans?" asked the Altarian recruit. "The humans are still out there," Zechthel said quietly. "Still free, still dangerous, still willing to die rather than submit. They have become the most respected and feared species in the galaxy, not because of their technology or their weapons, but because of their character." He turned back to face the crowd one final time. "That was my final lesson about humans. They do not fight because they are strong. They fight because they believe freedom is worth any sacrifice. And that belief makes them stronger than any weapon, more dangerous than any army."